This is part one of a two-part review. This video will cover narrative, the campaign, world design, the core gameplay loop, technical state, and monetization. The second review will cover the endgame rewards economy, itemization, PvP, and the raid. I've also worked with a very talented graphic artist to create a limited edition version of the script. It's 22 pages, it's 9,500 words, it's all beautifully done, and that's available exclusively to patrons. If you want to get that, just check the link in the description below. And with that, on with the video.
Does this thing go inside or outside your jacket? So we don't have these in the insurance business. You let everybody in. Everyone's a potential victim.
For most of his life, he was an insurance salesman. He wanted to serve in the military, but his eyesight was too poor, so he sold insurance instead. And so in 1980, he bought the insurance agency he'd been working for from his wife's grandmother, fully expecting that insurance would continue to be his life's work until the day he died. Things didn't quite turn out that way for old Tom Clancy. In 1984, Clancy sold his first piece of published work for the sum of $5,000. Not a small sum back then, but certainly not a great sum either, given how influential that work would go on to become. The Hunt for Red October went on to sell 45,000 copies, which was an impressive figure for a debut author, but it certainly fell short of the bestseller list that the publisher had hoped for it. Purely by chance, one of Ronald Reagan's presidential advisors, Michael Deaver, had stumbled upon the book and was so enamored of it that he ended up buying a few dozen copies and distributing it throughout the West Wing. A copy reached the desk of the president, and Reagan was hooked, and he immediately began telling everyone how much he loved it. He'd talk about it in interviews, and he'd bring it with him to events, he'd carry it onto Air Force One. The word got out through the White House press gallery, and when the general public learned that the President of the United States was a Tom Clancy fan, sales of The Hunt for Red October rose from 45,000 to 300,000 hardcover editions and 2 million paperback. Tom Clancy's ship had finally come in. By the way, guys, I hope you're enjoying these naval-themed introductions. I try and keep things consistent for you. Anyway, one thing that's fascinating about the publishing of The Hunt for Red October is that the publisher demanded that a full 100 pages be removed from the draft because it was simply too much technical jargon. The book was filled with hundreds of pages of minute detail describing the running of submarines and naval maneuvering and all sorts of other stuff. This sort of technical density just wasn't a feature of fiction at the time. Publishers believed that people just wanted the drama or the imagination. They didn't think readers were interested in exactly how orders for the turning of a submarine are relayed or the science behind radar technology. But even without those 100 pages, the novel was still packed with technical babble, and Tom Clancy showed the world that people love these details. Clancy is attributed to birthing the techno-thriller, one deeply grounded in real-world military technology, and giving the audience a deep understanding of that technology so they can feel immersed in the worlds he's writing.
In position. In position. In position. Alpha, go! Contact.
It's little surprise then that the Clancy license has resonated so strongly with the video game audience, where a commitment to tiny details is like manna from heaven for a huge portion of the player base. Clancy games have almost had as much impact on gaming as the novels have had on fiction. The original Ghost Recon and Rainbow Six games were seminal experiences that broadened our understanding of how video games could handle real-time, technical, strategy-based combat in both indoor and outdoor settings. This wasn't about being Rambo and blowing shit up, it was about being Chris Kyle, waiting for the exact right moment to strike and never missing when it counted. I think the core of a good Clancy game isn't a commitment to realism. Heaps of good Clancy games have been stuffed with made-up bullshit. Instead, I think it's about density and strategy. I think the best Clancy games have always felt dense and strategic because every step forward meant something. Every position you took, every enemy you set your sights on, every piece of equipment you brought with you or left behind. All of these were important decisions. Nothing came easy in those games. It was always hard fought through strategy and smarts rather than through mindlessly pulling the trigger.
Contact.
Hostile eliminated.
The Division 1 tried to create this, but even in its best moments, it fell short. The Division was less a cover-based shooter and more an action game where cover was helpful. Rather than intelligent positioning or strategy, the game's bullet sponge enemies simply demanded more bullets or more explosions, and in PvP, cover was a massive liability. You just wouldn't use it almost ever. I think the biggest achievement of Tom Clancy The Division 2 isn't the beautifully realized version of Washington DC. It isn't the teeming open world, full to bursting with dynamic activities. It isn't the highly sophisticated and overlapping rewards economy that makes every activity worth your time, and it isn't the fact that, bucking every recent trend, this is a live service game that didn't ship broken or incomplete. No. In my view, the biggest achievement of Tom Clancy's The Division 2 is that it delivers on the promise inherent in the Tom Clancy name. A dense and deeply strategic experience that's much closer to XCOM than it is Gears of War. There's no game like this right now. People will look at this and they'll see the same old Division combat, but it's not until they play it themselves that they'll see how finely tuned its components are, each of them doled out in just the right amount to challenge your situational awareness, your positioning, your cooldown usage, and your weapon skill. This is not the Division 1.5. The combat model here is vastly different and vastly improved over the first game, and I think it's this achievement more than any other that will see this game received as strongly as I predict it will be. We look at Rainbow Six Siege and we can bank that as a brilliant idea executed brilliantly. Well, I think we can finally do the same thing here. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my review of Tom Clancy's The Division 2. At E3 a few years ago, I interviewed the Division's creative director.
My name is Julian Garrity.
And I asked him why the Division 1, which had this really incredible setting and all the right foundations for a fantastic story, had such a crappy story. It was basically non-existent. A few sparse cutscenes, a silent protagonist, no real narrative arc throughout the whole thing, and an ending that answered absolutely none of the questions that were raised. When it came to narrative, the game essentially vacated the field, and I was wondering why that was. Julian told me that for he and his team, gameplay and the open world were their priorities, and they needed a story that could form around the player rather than forcing them into a specific path. This meant that narrative had to be amorphous and flexible, since players could do missions in whatever order they pleased, and perhaps not even do certain missions at all. It needed to be a sort of mosaic of stories that combined to form something, rather than a painted portrait of specific brushstrokes. The implication here is that narrative was not a major goal of the Division, and for what it's worth, that approach achieved the limited goals it set for itself. There was just enough story for things to make sense, and a few of the characters managed to leave an impression on us. It was the various forms of environmental storytelling that did the heavy lifting though, as audio logs and echoes and graffiti gave us insight into the way that New York fell and the way its various occupants managed the transition into chaos.
Come on, give her the fish sticks.
No, honey. We need those.
Shit, I forgot the radio Faye gave me at home. But I don't even like fish sticks.
I think the Division had a chance to adapt this approach with the sequel. Player feedback was clear that this world was compelling, and we wanted good stories told in it. Sadly, no such adaptation takes place here, and in most regards, the game actually takes steps backwards when it comes to the way it handles story. Characterization is the biggest misstep here. The characters from the first game, they had some personality. You loved the way that Paul Rhodes talked.
I hear a bunch of you people went missing when the shit hit the fan. Got some theories about that myself.
You cared about what happened to Faye's leg.
Hey, bad news. I'm not gonna be able to get out there. Not with my goddamn leg like this.
You felt the stress and anxiety emanating from Jessica Candle.
Yes.
Sorry, Dr. Kendall, but the sample's not producing results that...
Did you run them at room temperature?
Usually You said...
I said room goddamn temperature.
Here, you just don't know anyone, and no one says anything interesting. There's actually a shot at the end of the campaign where all the major NPCs are framed, and I thought to myself, oh yeah, I guess those were the stars of the story? Who was that guy again? The writing and performances of these characters just aren't as compelling this time around, and since you, the player, are still mute, it's not like you're able to contribute anything to the scene. You being silent continues to be really shitty. I'm really feeling like this is becoming quite a dated narrative technique in video games, as games like Metro Exodus would be straight up better if the protagonist could say something during these incredibly tense and emotional exchanges. Instead, and this is a true story, when I watch these cutscenes, I actually imagine that my agent is a cyborg. I imagine that the people speaking to him know that he won't talk back, and they're just venting like you would if no one was home and you were just talking to, like, Alexa.
Alexa, open the Division network.
The skill Division Network can help you with that.
These people know that my cyborg agent can't really process emotion, so they just talk about whatever they like while my agent waits for them to like give him objectives. He's basically RoboCop before RoboCop remembers that he's human. And when I had sort of adapted to this approach and started thinking this way, I actually started enjoying the cutscenes far more.
Well, Sheriff, I hope you're ready for some extra work.
Come quietly or there will be trouble.
Okay, so this next section contains a story spoiler, so if you don't want to listen to that, then just jump ahead to the time on screen. I'm gonna go in 3, 2, 1. Okay, here we go. Beyond the awkward cutscenes, the game never really manages to land narrative punches in its missions either. I mean, for example, there's this mission where you have to rescue the President of the United States, and that's a really big deal, right? Well, when you get to him, he basically like completely ignores you, and then he takes a phone call and he kind of rudely shouts at you, and then he just gets on this ladder and he just pieces out without really even saying anything.
Fuckers aren't going anywhere but down.
It's this dull thud of a moment when, if it was handled correctly, it could have been fucking epic. There's a cutscene afterwards which is fine, I guess, but your sort of mute cyborg character manages to suck the life out of that scene as well. This failure to build up characters extends to the way that villains are handled in the game, which is to say that there's not really any. In the Division 1, there were 1 or 2 villains like Amherst, who invented the virus, or Aaron Keener, the mysterious Division agent who was the first to go rogue. There's like no one here, like at all. Maybe I missed it and there is some sort of villain, but if it is there, I'm either really dumb or it's really hidden. This failure directly undermines mission design at times. Toward the end of the game, you start to assault these strongholds, which are these big chunky missions that are about you taking down the leadership of the various enemy factions.
This is a chance to wipe out the hyena leadership in one decisive blow. Get in there and hunt them down. Every last one of them.
But you don't know the names of any of these leaders that you're killing, so it isn't like some exciting grudge match where you finally get to take down these enemies that you've been chasing for dozens of hours, and they've like killed your best friend and they blew up an orphanage and they stole your girlfriend. No. They're just randomly generated names that you're hearing for the first time when you enter these places, so the boss encounters don't feel any more exciting than running into a random named enemy on the streets of Washington, DC. I've heard a lot of commentators and reviewers say that the narratively vacuous nature of this game is due to its unwillingness to tackle various political themes. And no, I'm not just talking about Jim Sterling's video here. A whole bunch of reviews have made the comment that this would have been a better and more interesting game had it been willing to grapple with the politics of the situation in a more overt way. I personally don't agree with this assessment. While I think it's perfectly fine for a game to be overtly political, it's also fine for a game to not be overtly political. Game makers have the luxury of that choice, and I don't think a game is inherently better or worse for them making that choice one way or the other. Clearly, Ubisoft wanted to utilize the backdrop of Washington, DC to allude to certain political themes, but they didn't want to make clear statements on those themes, and personally, I think they did a good job of maintaining a balance. The game is leaning into its setting and reference points, but it also isn't alienating people by putting forward specific political positions like guns are good or immigration is bad or whatever. I know a lot of things are inherently political, especially a city built on politics like Washington, but not everything needs to be partisan, and I think The Division 2 does respect that distinction. I try to judge a game based on what it's trying to do, and based on that, I don't think an injection of politics would have been the cure for what ails this game's narrative. Instead, it could have used a strong shot of intrigue, or conspiracy theory, or stronger characters to fight alongside, or imposing villains to be fighting against. It's all pretty threadbare here, and I think that had the game made the commitment to more compelling storytelling, the game might have been able to differentiate itself from its predecessor in such a way that it would be forever beyond the Division 1.5 label that I think a lot of people will try to apply to it. But despite the lackluster story, there's a fucking awesome campaign to enjoy here, so much so that I firmly believe that if you don't spend a single second in the Division 2's endgame, you still absolutely will have gotten your money's worth. Mission design is the cornerstone. There's such great missions you're doing. There's so many of them. There's main missions, I think there are about 15 of them, and then there's all the side missions, which in this game are actually almost as good as the main missions. I really do struggle to tell them apart. They're just so big and sprawling and engaging. They're anything but phoned in this time around, and a huge step up over the previous game. The main missions though are where things really shine. If you watched my Anthem review, you might remember that I said the job of a game designer is to trick players into not noticing that they were doing the same thing over and over again. Well, Massive seemed to have this trick down here. The various environments you're playing in are so jaw-droppingly detailed and so interesting that you're always looking forward to seeing what's around the next corner. It's always shooting waves of bad guys, but there's enough window dressing in these spaces and the objectives they set for you and the cinematic moments and the introduction of new enemy types and new mechanics that you're always feeling like you're experiencing something new. What's remarkable though is just how much is held back during the campaign and only delivered to you when you reach level 30. At this point, the entire map is invaded by a new enemy faction who will change up most of the missions to make them feel completely new again. I remember one time I was in this mission and I'd cleared it earlier and I felt pretty confident knowing where everything was about to spawn, but because it was an invaded mission, these guys like spawned behind me and I was like, holy shit, it didn't end well. You also get access to the world tier system, which asks you to gear up and complete certain missions, with each of the tiers gated by a stronghold mission. Advancing in tiers allows you to access higher tier loot and more challenging enemies. It's a bit restrictive since you need to hit the requisite gear score, but it's also really smartly designed because it ensures that players are properly geared before taking on the harder content, removing the chance that they'll be getting one shot or squaring off against enemies that are just too bullet spongy to be fun. Along with all of this comes 3 specialization trees that each bring a signature weapon and a host of perks that radically alter your playstyle, not to mention the hunt for exotic weapons and later on a raid which we don't know anything about, but hopefully it's good. Bucking every present trend, The Division feels like one of those roadmap games if the first step of the roadmap was make a good finished game with heaps of content. And you're going to see that for yourself before you even reach the end game. Despite a disappointing and anemic story, the campaign experience is among the best the looter shooter genre has ever offered up, and that's completely separate from the open world design, which I firmly believe is actually the best across the entire looter shooter genre. So let's take a look at that now. When Massive built their rendition of New York City, they did a remarkable job. For all the complaints about the game and its horrendous launch state, one thing everyone could agree on was that this shrunk down version of New York City was a huge achievement, visually stunning, dripping in atmosphere, and populated with an absurd amount of environmental detail. Even with all of this though, just ask any Division fan and they'll tell you there was just something special about it. It just had a certain feeling, like it was exactly the right space, created in exactly the right way, and that no other city could really compete with that feeling. New York City and the Division were inextricably linked, and no other city could hope to hold a candle to it. I certainly carry this belief as I played through the Division 2's beta phases. I enjoyed what I saw of the world, but as I explored more of it, I was left feeling that I'd have to settle for a more dynamic, but less atmospheric Washington DC. Having now completed the campaign, my thoughts on this have certainly evolved. Many people who step into the Division 2 will almost certainly experience a sensation of isolation as they begin roaming the streets, and I think that's because Washington DC does lack the atmosphere that New York City managed to achieve. New York's snow-covered streets felt right when they were empty because it was typically dark and cold. The scene sort of made sense to our brain. In Washington, it's summertime, it's typically hot, and here the empty streets feel somehow eerier for it. It's like our brains see sunny streets and they think, where is everyone? Like we're looking at a GTA environment with all of the people plucked out. But over time, it becomes apparent that Washington isn't trying to be New York. It's trying to be its own unique place, and it builds its own sense of identity on different foundations. At the bedrock of those foundations are Washington's landmarks. The Washington Monument, the Capitol Building, Lincoln Memorial, the Smithsonian, and dozens of other spaces. We've seen so many of these things before in either real life or in film that they have this sort of immediate resonance with us as we eye them from a distance or we climb over them up close. This is an important city. It's the seat of Western power since the end of World War II, and to be leading the rebuilding of civilization from inside the White House imbues your actions with a sense of gravitas that the New York Post Office just could never have achieved. I think the trappings of this world are far better utilized here than they were in New York as well. Yeah, you could fight in Madison Square Garden in New York, but here you can literally go full Nick Cage and just like recover the Declaration of Independence. Sure, you could light up Times Square before, but now I can step into the National Museum and blow up bad guys in the Vietnam War exhibition, mounted gun and all. Throughout the entire campaign, I can tell that the developers visit all of these places in Washington and ask themselves, okay, what's some cool shit we can do with this space? The range of indoor and outdoor locations you'll visit is just huge, and it's so well realized that it almost feels like virtual tourism. And New York just wasn't able to accomplish anything close to that, despite how much I love that game's setting. But the heart of the world design isn't the monumental Capitol building or the skyscraping Washington Monument. It's the tiny alleyway that you would never have noticed had an enemy not been shooting at you from there, where you follow it and it leads to an office building, which leads to a car park, which leads to a sewer, which leads to some hidden encounter you never would have expected to bump into. Of all the looters I've ever played, the world of Washington DC is the most ripe for exploration and just getting lost in it. There are so many hidden areas throughout the map, and they aren't waiting to be found, they're actively hiding from you. They don't want to be found, so you have to go and look for them, and it's always so rewarding when you do, because this game is built on the fundamental design premise that every second spent in the game should be productive and rewarding. That means that if you do choose to start wandering around, you are going to find so much hidden loot, so many important supplies, so many crafting components, so many enemies who themselves will drop loot. This isn't exploration for exploration's sake. Ubisoft make it worth your while every step of the way, and that's absolutely how it should be in any open world game like this. To top off this incredible world setting is the introduction of weather cycles. Now in the Division 1, you sort of had these, but they didn't really mean anything. Now you can be in dense fog that's so dense you can barely see 10 feet in front of you, or better yet, you can be in the middle of a thunderstorm with thunder clapping and rain pouring and you can't see anything, and the light from the street lights is your only hope of any visibility.
Setting up a turret.
I tell you, I played more Division than I care to think about, but this level 14 firefight was one of the most memorable I've had yet, because the weather effects made it so. They're like modifiers on the map, and when they arrive, they completely change up the combat experience, putting an entirely new premium on skills like Pulse, which help mark enemy locations for you. No matter when you choose to walk away from the Division, I think you'll do so with an appreciation for this space, and with just as many memories of the quiet, undiscovered backstreets as you have memories of Washington's most recognizable landmarks. This isn't New York, and part of me still misses New York, but I've really come to respect the aesthetic that Ubisoft have created here with their version of Washington DC. I think this is a world worth seeing and worth exploring and worth getting lost in, and it's not easy to build worlds like that. And it's even harder to fill them full of awesome shit to do no matter which way you turn, but Ubisoft have done precisely that.
And then once we hit on that and we sort of really mastered our fear of having a very linear, very flat difficulty scheme, that's what resulted in us eventually saying, you know what would be very cool? If we allowed players, if we unlocked all the waypoints and allowed them to go anywhere and slay anything.
When Diablo 3 first launched, it was a disaster. The gameplay loop was really refined, with excellent class design, but the reward economy was completely busted by the real money auction house, and there was absolutely no endgame whatsoever. It just consisted of running Inferno difficulty, which was exactly the same as the campaign, except everything would one-shot you. It was a joke. Diablo 3 famously went on to reinvent itself, and in so doing imparted a number of important lessons about what players expect from a contemporary looter, and nestled among its hundreds of changes and new ideas was this thing, the adventure map. Now, the core conceit of the adventure map is the understanding that at their most basic level, looters are about doing the same thing over and over again, so to make that interesting, you have to trick the player into not noticing. The content here in the adventure map is very similar to what you'd be doing if you were just playing through the campaign repeatedly, but the map mixes up the order of everything, so you're jumping between different locations one after another rather than doing them in sequential order, and it has a random assortment of objectives, and its reward system is such that it incentivizes you to keep playing because the rewards accumulate over time. Its map markers change dynamically, so it always looks different, and you can rely on it to continue to keep your experience feeling fresh, even though you're always engaging the same core gameplay loop. Now, I have to say that I think the Division 2's open world map design and reward economy is the single best I've ever seen in a looter, and I think it's because it embraces the same concepts that underpin Diablo's adventure map. It's always dynamically mixing up the locations you're fighting in, the enemies you're fighting against, and the objectives you're completing, which keeps the whole thing feeling fresh even though you're always just shooting bad guys in the face. If you played the Division 1, you might remember a very static and one-dimensional open world. Missions were the focus of the game, and the various on-street encounters you could participate in were fairly meaningless. The streets of New York City were essentially thoroughfares for you to move through towards your next objective. I would go as far as to say that here in the Division 2, despite the superb mission design, the open world is the real star of the show. It's just way more diverse and way more interesting than I could have expected. So much so that a campaign that can be rushed through in 12 hours took me 35 hours because I spent so much time just participating in random open world activities. The way it works is there's about 10 different districts throughout the map, and a few of them have settlements. These are large congregations of survivors trying to rebuild, and it's your job to help them out. They'll ask you to complete specific main missions and side missions, and doing so will unlock new renovations for the settlement and even more missions for you to complete. You'll also get access to projects which ask you to donate materials or complete activities in that district, which will reward you with XP, items, or blueprints for crafting. Outside the settlements are the mean, untamed streets of Washington, D.C., and it's your job to get them under control. You're going to be directing a lot of your attention towards these things, control points, which are fortified areas that require you to take down the enemy that has set up base there. They're actually really rewarding encounters because they're some of the most challenging content in the game, with the open world design providing a unique twist separate from the more narrow and contained mission combat. Claiming these control points gives you access to lucrative supply rooms, and if you manage to hold onto that control point, you can return to this room every 24 hours for free loot. How do you keep these points, you ask? Well, this is where supplies like food, water, and components come in. As you explore the map, you'll be looting this stuff all the damn time, so you can then hand it over to these control points and keep them up and running. But that's not the only way to get them. As you explore the world, you'll bump into civilians who are out on resource gathering expeditions, and if you're with them, they'll have the courage to enter buildings and collect resources and take them back to control points, adding to those resource levels. You can even find enemy convoys trying to do the same thing, and you can interrupt their supply lines by taking those supplies for yourself. It all feels so dynamic and interesting as you're aiming to keep all of these control points alive across the map. There's even more depth to this system though. There are a variety of random open world activities peppered throughout the map, things like public executions and propaganda broadcasts and territory control and a bunch of others. And when you reach the end game, these events become connected to the local control point, so that if you complete these smaller events, you can actually level up the control point, making it harder to take down but also way more rewarding. And the reward part really matters because the overlapping economy of rewards is key to the looter genre. Ubisoft understand that, and they've built this entire game around the idea that every single thing you do should be highly lucrative, and it absolutely is. I mean, for example, there are various SHD tech caches scattered throughout the map, and this is an important currency because it's what you use to unlock your skills and your perks. Most of them are hidden away in some corner of the map, and in chasing them, you're going to bump into all of these world events I've spoken about, which reward you with loot or supplies, or you're going to loot chests scattered throughout the map, which award you even more loot, or you're you're going to find some secret named boss hidden in some sewer who will award you even more loot or precious crafting materials that you can use to, upgrade your crafting bench so that you can craft even better items. You cannot do anything in this game without tripping over tons of loot, valuable currencies, or crafting materials. It's just impossible. Try to do it. Try to do something in this game for 30 minutes and not see a significant return on investment for your time. It just isn't possible. I think much of the mythology surrounding the Diablo 3 transformation exists because the developers were kind enough to write it all down in a PowerPoint presentation. Loot 2.0 is a phrase that many of us would be familiar with at this point, but it isn't just about good loot or more loot. It's dozens of things, hundreds of things, all of them working in concert to create the perfect experience for the fan of the skin-in-a-box looter game. Diablo 3 laid down a template that other games could follow, and I think The Division 2 sets down a template of its own. If you were to design an open-world looter shooter, you would look at the diversity of locations and objectives spread throughout the map of Washington, DC, and the way that all of these are linked, and you'd say, yes, let's do that in our game. You would look at the extraordinarily generous and overlapping rewards economy, and you'd say, yes, let's do that in our game. My mind really does wander as I think about what could be achieved if these systems were applied to other looters like Destiny or Warframe or perhaps Anthem as it goes through its rebuilding process. This is genre-leading stuff, and if you're a fan of this genre, then you absolutely do not want to miss it. Way back in 1994, developer Mythos Games and Microprose developed a game called UFO Enemy Unknown. It was about an extraterrestrial combat unit, or XCOM for short, who had to stave off an alien invasion. You controlled a squad of dudes, they had weapons and armor, they shot aliens in their big stupid alien faces, all pretty standard stuff for gaming back in 1994. The twist though was that this wasn't an action game, it was a turn-based strategy game. Instead of moving your soldiers in real time, the map was divided into grids and each unit could move a certain number of squares. There was a huge focus on being behind cover since shooting was based on a dice roll, and the more exposed you were, the greater chance that the enemy would be able to land a successful shot. The brilliance of the XCOM formula, which were carried right through to the modern versions of the game, were that planning, preparation, positioning, strategy, and tactics were the key to success. XCOM was a chess game. You needed to be thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead, and if you ever found yourself surprised, then it was probably already too late. I had this moment when I was playing The Division 2, I was in a match-made squad and we were all playing pretty carefully, but I got pretty cocky and I decided to push forward into a new position without really taking note of my surroundings. I didn't have my recon drone out or a pulse, so I had no idea where the enemy could be, but I just sort of moved up anyway, and like clockwork, the enemy came and they put me the fuck down. What happened here is that I stopped playing chess and I started playing Gears of War. And you just cannot do that here. You cannot YOLO your way through this game because preparation and positioning are all infinitely more important than your aim. It was in this moment that I thought to myself, man, this is basically just real-time XCOM. I mean, think about it, right? A squad of soldiers, all of them inherently weak and exposed, heavily reliant on cover to stop them from getting one shot, tanky enemies that require more than a few bullets to bring down, plenty of abilities that bring situational advantage, exploitable objects in the environment, things like that suppression mechanic that you can use to keep enemies locked in cover, a huge premium placed on like high ground and flanking positions. All of this is just so XCOM. If you're in any doubt about all this, it's probably because on the surface the combat looks quite similar to the previous Division. It looks like the same soldiers with backpacks, shooting bullet sponges with the same guns from the first game, so you'd certainly be forgiven for thinking that this is just a rehashed combat loop superimposed on a new city. But this assumption is just so incorrect, and I don't think most reviewers will sort of explain why this is the case. They just sort of focus on the open world and the loot, so I'm going to break it down in a lot of detail here because I really want to make sure the developers get the credit they deserve for designing a combat model as functional and as strategic as this. The start of this is understanding what was wrong with combat in the original Division. Now, on the surface, the game looked quite tactical, but really it was anything but that as soon as you understood how it all worked. The main issue was that cover was more often a liability than anything else, since you had a lot of health and were able to tank huge amounts of damage in PvE. And in PvP, cover robbed you of your maneuverability, which was the most valuable thing you had. If things were to get even a little bit hairy, you could rely on the game's instant healing ability to immediately restore yourself to full health, and if you used that at the right time, it would proc a special perk that made you practically invulnerable. And if all that failed, you could pop your recovery link super, which was just more heals, like all the heals at once, that's it, okay? All of this meant that your health and armor pools were huge in both PvE and PvP contexts, and you could very confidently ignore cover in a majority of situations because of that. On top of this, enemy AI was really dumb, and its difficulty was propped up more by the amount of HP that the enemies had rather than their numbers or their tactics or their abilities, which meant that you never really had to worry about them flanking you or disrupting your combat flow. They were like Diablo enemies. They were dumb meat sacks, and you would dictate the rhythm of combat, not them. All of this is completely different here in the Division 2. Firstly, health. You are really, really squishy here in the Division 2. Like, really squishy.
Agent vital signs, 0.
If you are out of position for even a second, you will very often find yourself burst down immediately. And if you do get low, there's no instant heal, no cheesy perks, no healing ultimate to rely on. If you want to heal, you have to do it from behind cover using an armor kit that takes a few seconds to apply, or a skill that applies healing over time. This means that you cannot dump your health in exchange for damage output. It's just never a good equation. Instead, you have to sit in cover and either wait for opportunities or create them through intelligent ability usage or flanks. This change alone fundamentally disrupts and improves the entire combat experience in the Division 2, making it a vastly more strategic game that feels far closer to what we should have had all along. But that is just the beginning. We need to talk about the AI. Man, the AI in this game is so good. Okay, looters are very much player-driven combat experiences, right? The player is all-powerful, and enemy AI is very dumb. It's generally their job just to present themselves as targets so that you can just mow them down. And difficulty tuning is essentially just more of the same enemies or enemies having more health. But even in these circumstances, the player is still very much in control of the flow of combat. Now, consider something outside the looter genre, still a shooter, Halo. At the lower difficulties of Halo, you are in control of combat. The enemies are not intelligent or particularly lethal. It's about your power fantasy as a one-man army. Crank up the difficulty to heroic or legendary and this completely flips. Enemies are more heavily armored, they are faster, they hit harder, and they are more intelligent. In these difficulties, they determine the flow of combat, and you and the Chief are just trying to survive. Division 2 feels like playing Division 1 on Halo's heroic or legendary difficulty. As you progress through the game, you're going to go up against different factions that each display increasingly sophisticated AI and movesets, culminating at level 30 with the Black Tusk, who are a paramilitary faction equipped with pretty much the same technology that you're using, not to mention things like EMP grenades and giant Wall-E robots and this crazy robot dog sniper thing and whatever. And they're really smart. They're actually intelligent. They are constantly pushing on you, trying to force you out of your comfort zone. They are constantly flanking you. I cannot tell you the number of times I have been successfully flanked in this game, and that hasn't happened to me in any video game for years because games just aren't trying to make interesting AI these days. The Division 2 tries and succeeds because its difficulty scales the way that Halo's difficulty scaled. It's about enemy intelligence and lethality rather than just enemy numbers or HP. The diversity of skills available to you are an important change as well. Each skill now has a much longer cooldown unless you gear specifically towards reducing it, meaning that deploying skills now feels like a far more meaningful choice. By default, the skills almost feel like cooldowns in a game like World of Warcraft, stuff that's very powerful but it has a long recharge time, so you kind of need to carefully plan when you want to deploy it. There's fewer skills on offer here, but with all of their variants, you're actually getting more flexibility than the Division 1, like the drone ability, for example, which can serve serve as either a bombardier, very useful for knocking people out of cover, or a machine gun drone which lays down sustained damage, or a healbot drone to keep you and your allies topped up, or a recon drone if you spec into the marksman specialization, giving you an extremely useful view of every enemy combatant. It was really the recon drone that made me appreciate just how well designed this suite of skills is. Like at first I was like, man, who the fuck would want a drone that just highlights targets, right? That's useless. But when you see how big these maps are, and you see how often you get flanked, you immediately appreciate an eye in the sky that can keep targets permanently marked so that you can ensure that you are never going to get rushed without knowing that it's coming first. Every skill I've used has this value. Every one brings something to the table, and that's a big change from the previous game where a large portion of the overall skill tree was just filler. Within this highly strategic combat framework are some excellent shooter fundamentals that demonstrate that Massive know exactly how this genre works at this point. Weapons have all been completely redesigned. Yes, many of them are returning from the previous game, but they've all been redone, from sound design to handling to damage to everything. Some weapons have entirely new identities now, like the FAL, which used to be a burst fire weapon, but it's now full auto, or the M4, which used to be the staple assault rifle of the previous game, but now it's a semi-automatic weapon, and a damn good one at that. Destiny or Warframe have the freedom to simply invent new weapons out of thin air, but the Tom Clancy brand means that trying to remain at least a little bit true to reality is sort of important. Weapons is one area where the devs try to maintain that commitment, and they've done a terrific job of making each weapon feel fresh, despite it sharing the same name and design from the previous game. Existing Division fans in particular will be very impressed with the work done here. So let's talk about bullet sponges, that old chestnut. Now, I think they've solved this problem, but your mileage may vary. First of all, the Division 1 just had nothing but purple and yellow bar enemies once you reached a certain difficulty level, and that meant that everything felt spongy. Speaking to the developers back then, I learned this was because they had a limit on the number of units they could have active at a time, so to increase difficulty they had to up enemy health. Here in the sequel, it's clear they've made up a lot of ground from an optimization perspective, and there are times when you can have upwards of like a dozen enemies active on screen at once. This means that the game has more license to pepper in red bar enemies who are very low health and very easy to bring down. This provides an immediate sense of satisfaction and breaks up the monotony of constantly shooting at really high HP enemies. For purple bar enemies, you're gonna find them fairly spongy, but you now have skills that are specifically designed to shred armor, like the new chem launcher. You now have specific ways to break through that other than just, fire more bullets. As for the big, tanky, yellow bar enemies, yeah, these guys have a lot of health, but they're also fully armored up, and their armor is now breakable. So when you finally punch through their helmet or their chest plate or whatever, their body is now fully exposed and they will take full damage. In my view, this solves the cognitive dissonance that always made the Division's enemies feel ridiculously spongy, but as I said, your mileage may vary. Enemies still take way more than a few bullets to bring down, so if that style of play just doesn't work for you, then you are likely not going to enjoy the Division 2. At the most minute level, the Division's combat demonstrates an expert attention to detail. It's always clear where you are being shot from. You get advanced warning through audio tells when an enemy is rushing you. Grenadiers will telegraph when they are throwing a grenade, and it will be lit up for you as it arcs towards you at a comedically slow pace, allowing you to shoot it out of the sky. Enemy engineers will announce when they are dropping drones and turrets so you could react.
Deploying UAV.
You will hear the hollowed out thunk sound of the noob tube when an enemy fires off a grenade launcher, giving you time to move away. These are all the hallmarks of functional combat in video games, because the player is constantly being fed all of the information they need to react to the situation and feel like a highly skilled combatant. But these reactive elements of the combat model, they really aren't the heart and soul of it. Like XCOM, the Division's combat isn't about reaction, it's about forethought. It's about thinking, what if that enemy over there tries to flank me or rush me? What if that enemy over there takes the high ground before I do? What if I need my ability on the next wave of enemies because I know that 2 heavies will spawn then? What if I take up this position, which limits my view of the center area, but ensures we aren't unexpectedly flanked? At this point, the Division 2 is just as much a strategy game as it is an action game, and it will be so fascinating to see where the developers will be able to take this combat model with the release of the full endgame and a raid over the coming weeks. As we begin to wrap up this review, we need to knock over some of the particulars. Let's talk performance first. I tested the Division 2 on two PCs, one of them with a GTX 2080 Ti and the other one with a GTX 2060. Both of them ran really well. I had horrendous performance during the beta, so clearly a lot of work has been done in the intervening period. On the 2080 Ti, I was able to maintain a really solid sort of 80 frames on ultra settings, and on the 2060, I dropped the settings a fair amount to arrive at a very solid 60 frames. I ran DirectX 12, which provided a huge performance boost over DirectX 11, so if that's an option available to you, I strongly recommend it. I wasn't able to test console performance, but I have heard there have been some issues on both PS4 and Xbox, with frame drops being fairly regular. I'm not surprised given how much detail this game is rendering and how many units are on screen at a time. I'd say that this game is probably never going to run particularly well on a console. The Division 1 was never a stable game on console. It was sort of tolerable and sometimes it was downright awful. If you aren't willing to put up with some pretty shitty performance sometimes, then I would steer clear of the Division. Bugs are up next. Division 1 was crippled by its bugs. There was a bug at launch that literally stopped a huge portion of the player base from even being able to log into the game at all, and that was just the first of many game-breaking bugs that this game would suffer from. Even towards the end of its life cycle, the game was still very buggy, but only in a way that was seen or felt by the more hardcore players, since the bugs were much more subtle in their impact. By and large, the Division 2 has been a surprisingly bug-free experience with a few important disclaimers. First and foremost, a bug relating to skill usage has reared its ugly head, and they said they've sort of fixed it now, but they said also maybe not. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the state will be when this video goes live, but the developers are on it, they're fixing it. It was certainly a very big problem. It basically made it impossible to use most of the game's skills. This is a critical game-breaking bug that drove everyone, myself included, absolutely crazy. Still, it's been the only deal-breaking bug thus far, and other bugs have been more specific to certain players or have had less impact on the overall experience. More bugs will be found as the time goes on, and more bugs will emerge as this thing progresses. So I think I should stress that if you choose to sign up to the Division, you kind of also need to expect that there's going to be some bugs along the way, because massive, try as they might, have not been able to nail this at any point in the Division's life cycle. But I will say that the launch state of this product is worlds better than the Division 1, and despite serious bugs like the skills bug, most people are talking about how much they're enjoying the game rather than the bugs they're experiencing, and I think that's a testament to the overall quality of the product. I think it's always a give and take with these things, and if developers have clearly put in the effort to craft a terrific product, then we're okay with a few bugs. But if the game is shit and buggy as hell, then you really can't expect much mercy from your consumers. As for monetization, there's a mix of good and bad here. The first thing I'll say is that all future content for the game will be free of charge. That includes new story content and additions to the endgame. The developers have made clear that we can expect more endgame specializations, more raids, and even a return of the survival battle royale game mode, so to know that you won't have to spend a dime on any of that is really great news. There's a Year 1 pass available, which gives you 7 days early access to this new content, some additional side content like bounties and projects, and some cosmetics. I don't like the idea of early access at all, as it splits the community and gives people an unfair advantage in PvP, but you can make up your own mind about all of that. Besides these Year 1 pass cosmetics, you can earn every cosmetic item in the game while playing it, and that's great. If you want to speed up the process, you can buy the items from the apparel store, which allows you to purchase exactly what you want. You can also buy loot boxes that contain these cosmetic items, and you can earn keys that allow you to open these loot boxes for free by playing. I don't like loot boxes at all in any game, but I know that my views on this are rather extreme. Still, I will say that overall, the monetization strategy here doesn't feel particularly exploitative, because there's no paying for power and you can earn everything for free. I just wish there wasn't any early access and no loot boxes. If this monetization approach seems inoffensive, it's probably because it seems to have been informed by years of experimentation and feedback, and Ubisoft have responded to that. It feels like a contemporary monetization model, just like the Division 2 feels like a contemporary shooter. My theory is that in 2016, with the major development work of the Division 1 wrapped up, the various Ubisoft studios working on the game turned their minds and efforts towards the sequel, and in so doing, they asked themselves one simple question: what if we made a looter shooter that didn't suck at launch. It's impossible to divorce the success of The Division 2 from the broader failure of its genre. A mere 4 weeks ago, Anthem emerged from 6 full years in development and millions of dollars spent in marketing and influencer hype, and the game was a total and utter failure, and that is beyond question at this point as the game lurches from one drama or controversy to the next. In reviewing that game, I commented how broken the live service development model had become. Destiny proved it, Division 1 proved it, Destiny 2 proved it again, but even beyond that we had stuff like Fallout 76 comprehensively proving it, and Battlefield 5 as well. These were all games that went out broken and incomplete, using their roadmaps as a selling point. They ship a minimum viable product and position the promise of future content as one of the game's virtues, obscuring the obvious fact that the content they're pointing to should have been in from the start. It never should have got to this point, ever. It never should have reached the point where companies are so comfortable shipping broken, unfinished games, and it never should have reached the point where we look at a game like The Division 2 and cannot help but praise it for being functional and complete, for having enough content in at launch to satisfy the promises made during the hype phase. Yet, here we are, and I will praise The Division 2 for that, because in an era where this is the exception to the norm, we need to hold these examples up and remind publishers what we expect when we lay down our cash for a game. Beyond functionality and completeness, there is a design robustness here that the looter genre has not seen since Borderlands 2, Diablo 3, Destiny, Destiny 2, The Division, Anthem. These were all games that seem to have been designed in vacuums, completely unaware of all of the advances that their genre had made over the last 2 decades. They seem to make the same mistakes in the same way, and I think that part of the reason that Anthem was such a disappointment to so many was because it seemed the most backward and outdated example we've seen yet, as though BioWare have never even played any of these games, let alone studied how to make them properly. The Division 2 stands in such stark contrast to this because it seems to have studied and applied all of the accumulated knowledge of not only its own genre, but genres beyond it. Its open world shows a level of organic dynamism that's closer to stuff like Grand Theft Auto than it is anything else. Its reward economy is more generous and more overlapping than I can point to across the entire looter shooter or MMO spectrum. Its combat is imbued with a sense of tactical depth typically reserved for strategy games, and its stunning mission design and presentation make this a rewarding investment for even those who have no interest whatsoever in grinding the game's considerable endgame or PvP. This isn't a case of The Division meeting a minimum standard and being praised for that. The Division 2 isn't good because it's functional and complete. It's good because it's an honest to goodness step forward for this genre, and I expect we'll be referencing its lessons for many years to come.